The following is an excerpt from Not Meant to Know by Dustin and Adam Koski, read by the Volgun. The air in that room hurt to breathe. A scent of rot stung my nose. Worst of all, the heat was so intense and humid that it was like holding a hot coffee in my mouth. In the middle of the room, the air shimmered with the haze you would see over a pot of boiling water. I knew it wasn't just my eyes watering. Jesus Christ, my apprentice Helen said behind me, swallowing the profanity to avoid insulting our host. Terrence Johnson, the young man we were there to see, was propped up against the far wall, on pillows. His breathing was labored, but deep. His head had rolled limply to the left, and his eyes rolled back into his head. The skin of his head and chest was albino pale. The flesh on his appendages was necrotic up to the forearms and knees. Albert, the poor man's father, joined us as I walked around the bed to his son's left. I could hear his hands anxiously rubbing, even over his son's breathing, but the young man's throat commanded my attention. He had no reaction as I opened his jaws and shone a flashlight into his mouth. "I see," I said. "No pustules in his throat." "Well, what is it, Adrian?" his father asked. "Not here." I made the sign of a cross. "We should go outside." As I rose to walk away, I glanced down at Terrence. His eyes had corrected themselves enough that I could see his pupils, and I suspected he could see me. When we reached the end of Albert Johnson's cracked driveway, I was confident I had restored my brave face. "Now, the demon that has possessed your son is a mortal one," I told Albert. "Its presence is a bane against all life, not just a bringer of ungodliness and sickness." "That's why the hospital couldn't even find any bacteria in his blood?" Albert responded, as if he were solving a mystery. "Yes, now you should know, this evil of Satan's did not need your son to commit any sin to enter him. That's how powerful this being is. We have time, but I do not want him to suffer a moment longer than absolutely necessary." "You really mean that? He didn't sin?" Albert interrupted. "You're not just telling me that because of my reputation?" Albert Johnson had been a minor local celebrity. He had sued the Catholic Church long ago, slightly before it had become an international scandal that the Vatican was protecting child predators. He claimed then to have abandoned his belief in churches, but his belief in God was only stronger. Knowing that, I put a hand on his shoulder. "A person's life is at stake. I would not lie to you about matters of the spirit," I told him, putting a hand over the crucifix I'd printed on my shirt. "Not with the loss I've also suffered." "I believe you," he told me with a nod. "Now, I have holy relics we must collect from my office for the exorcism, and texts we must consult now that we know precisely what we're dealing with. If it is God's will, we will have your son free again this evening." Albert nodded back at me. I gestured for Helen to come with me, and we made for my car. After opening the door, I noticed that Albert stood looking at the ground, overwhelmed by the enormity of the situation. As we drove away, Helen stared forward, her mouth slightly agape. There really was something unnatural in that room, Helen said. It was her first encounter with the tangibly supernatural. Helen had been assisting me for months. Helen had made it clear time and time again that she thought my knowledge of the supernatural had as much basis in reality as the tooth fairy. But a paycheck was a paycheck. "Yes, it's very different from the movies," I answered while glancing from her to the road and back. "No telekinesis, no colorful profanity, just a horribly afflicted person and a malignant presence in the air." "You were lying to him with all that shit about God, weren't you?" she half asked. In the time we'd spent together, I hadn't espoused any specifically Christian beliefs until that day. Believing that spiritual matters only consist of a Christian God in opposition to Satan is like believing that World War II was fought between only France and Italy. What we're dealing with is far beyond the dominion of either of them. "You weren't lying about your daughter, though," she said. "Now or back when I met you?" There was a long pause while we were stuck at a red light. I had lost my daughter Julia years earlier to a demon as well. I was no local celebrity for it, as my only bit of publicity occurred when I gave a talk about it in the basement of my local library. During that talk, I'd seen Albert and Terrence in the small audience. It had been shortly after that talk that Helen expressed interest in being my assistant. "We need to concentrate on the task at hand. I need to check the database in my office. You'll need to get out all the Christian props. I gave more instructions on the long drive back to the school. It's not an accredited religious institution, just a rundown strip mall where we held sales pitches barely disguised as classes. One look at the sign along the top of the building, reading School of the Hidden Truth, would let you know all about what a 2-bit operation I was running. My classroom was just a repurposed sales floor for what was formerly a ratty video store. It was perfect for convincing most people that my supernatural activities were a sham. For the rest of the story, follow the link below.